Cool. Eric's going on vacation. Pray for him. David is going to bring the message. Okay, so David is one of our leaders. Yay, David. Woo! David's one of our leaders. Over the next few weeks, we have a few of our leaders speaking. I'm really excited for David to speak. Now, we're all wearing masks, so when David looks around, give some big nods and smiley eyes and let him know that you're paying attention and looking, and laugh when it's appropriate and all of that. Cool. May the Lord bless you.
Thank you. It's good to be here at night. I think it's been a while. I didn't think that it would ever happen to me because what I'm about to tell you would ever happen to me. I used to stay up really, really late when I worked at a restaurant, and so like 2 a.m. would roll around, and I'd think, okay, I've got a good couple of hours left before I really should go to bed. And now I go to bed at 9, so it's good to be here with the late crew for the long haul. So I'm going to start out by just reading the passage. I know Mark did it, but let me just start there. He put another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches." He told them another parable. "The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. All these things Jesus said to the crowds in parables. Indeed, he said nothing to them without a parable." Jesus, thank you for this community. Thank you for these dear people. I just ask that you bless the words of my mouth. May they and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, our strength and Redeemer. Amen. So, we are now done with the armor of God. You never have to think about the armor of God ever again. Just kidding. But we've moved towards talking about parables during this Lenten season. So last week Eric talked about the parable of the seed getting scattered. Someone got it. That was quick. No one made any comments in the morning service about the pair of bowls. So you guys are with it. So Eric talked about the seed getting scattered and the meaning of that parable. And a few things that he brought up that I want to bring back. So one, there's the concept of a parable being something that's rolled up, and you unroll it, and then you look at it, and it tells you something, and then you roll it back up, and then when you unroll it again and look at it again, it shows you a new truth. So I wanted to expound on that. I think parables are like a tape measure. So it always has, God's truth is the same when you roll it, when you look at it now and then you look at it later. But depending on what I'm measuring, that truth is going to have different applications. So that's one of the things I want to think about as we're going through parables. Parables often show us what we've missed, not so much what we haven't ever seen before, but what we've missed. And in particular, so I want to look at these parables as how they're teaching us what it looks like to apply the armor of God. So we're wearing the armor of God, and now we're taking action in God's kingdom. All of these parables are about the kingdom of heaven. So in this passage, the 2 parables that here are brought up here, Jesus doesn't explain them in the scriptures afterwards. So there is some ambiguity, and I think this is an opportunity for us to use one of our values at the Village of creativity and imagination and look at it and say, okay, what is God telling us? But what that requires is for us to remain grounded in Scripture. So it's not just that I say, okay, well, I think that you all need to give me $5 and send that in and then put it in an envelope and then I'll be off at the end of it, and no one can challenge my application. Well, no, what we need is for us to be like Bereans, which were a group of people that Paul wrote to in the New Testament, and he told them things and they knew Paul, but at the same time they were eagerly listening. They were all also comparing what he said to the other scriptures and saying, okay, does this line up with what God has said is true? So keep that in mind as we're going through. So I mentioned that all these parables are about the kingdom. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what the kingdom of heaven is and what the implications are. So when you think of a kingdom, there may be different things. One of the big things that comes to mind for me is you've got a castle and a realm, but really the main thing that you need in a kingdom is for there to be a ruler, a king. And in the case of the kingdom of heaven, that ruler is Jesus, and that's God. And Jesus' authority is very central and important to the kingdom of heaven. So I'm going to read this passage from Luke. When he, being Jesus, had entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, "Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly." And he said to him, "I will come and heal him." But the centurion replied, "Lord, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes, and to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, "Truly, I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith." So Jesus is saying, wow, this guy recognizes authority and the authority that I have, and he really hit on something. So with Jesus' authority is incredibly important. And the way that authority is exercised, it comes in different forms, but all those, I think, can be summed up in the law. And there are different meanings of the law, so I want to go through those. So the first and most obvious are rules. And the law gets a bad rap in two ways. One, we can take the law and say, this is how I'm going to earn salvation. This is how I'm going to earn approval with God. And so we have to be uber focused on following every single thing. And that's how we're going to earn our salvation. And that's a mistake. But then the other side of it is, while we just say, let's just throw out the law entirely because, Jesus came and he died and there's forgiveness, so we don't have to worry about that, and so let's just ignore the law completely. Well, ultimately what the law is in the context of rules is God saying, this is what is right and wrong. This is what's valuable. So when you go through the Old Testament, all of the laws of God are either teaching us how to value other humans, how to value each other, or how to recognize the value of God and his majesty. Psalm 19:7 says, "The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple." So, while we can go too far to certain extremes, I want to keep rules and right and wrong as that's part of what the law in the kingdom is. But it's probably the most surfacey. So next, we have influence. Influence is one of the terms I looked at when I was looking up what the law is. And influence came up. I think the best way to think of that is the way that they, in the old Westerns, the sheriff would come and law has been restored. So there's this sense, the sheriff isn't just shooting up everybody who's committed crimes. Maybe that happened, but really it's the goodness and the benevolence that comes when someone who is in charge is in their proper position. So this is Theoden in Return of the King, and I think he's one of the great pictures of the impact that proper execution of the law comes in. So Theoden starts out in the previous book as old and withered and weak, and he's under the spell of Saruman, and he's not taking care of his kingdom. People are getting taken advantage of, and everything's bad. Whereas conversely here, Theoden's leading the armies of Rohan into battle to help their allies in Gondor, and Theoden's actually riding to his death. But here, Rohan is restored. Things are good when the proper king is in place. So in the same way, when Jesus is on his throne, in whatever context or capacity that is a good thing. And I think in some ways that's obvious, but that's also something we have to keep telling ourselves, because we actually want to be on the throne in our lives. So we have to keep remembering it is good when Jesus is on his throne. In the Old Testament, in Ezekiel, he has this vision, and he says, I fell on my face as the glory of the Lord entered the temple by the gate facing east. The Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the temple. I like that verse. It reminds me of the one that Keith often leads us in, where we keep coming back to, your glory fills the temple. And there's just something, it's good to recognize, wow, when God is present and when he is on his throne, it is a good thing. Hebrews says, but of the Son, being Jesus, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. So that's the second aspect of the law that I think is important to consider. And the final is one that Jim alluded to a couple weeks ago in his sermon, and that is the kind of the laws of physics, or just reality, the way things work. So I really like what this Looney Tunes cartoon illustrates. So this poor coyote, he's just looking for food. He's trying to make his way in the world, and this darn roadrunner keeps getting away. And in most of the cartoons, he somehow tricks the coyote into running off a cliff. And the coyote, takes several steps and usually does like a skid in midair, turns back, looks down, and then he falls. And so I think it's important to consider why that's funny. That's funny because we know that's not the way reality actually works. So reality is not dependent on your understanding of your current situation. Part of what the world tells us is that your perspective, your truth is all that matters. You just have to believe your truth and you're good. But Eric talked about the belt of truth being incredibly important as a part of the armor of God, being you have to believe that what God says about truth and reality, that's what reality is. So Hebrews chapter 1 says, he is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. So that goes into multiple realms, and it starts with things like the laws of physics, such as gravity, but I think it goes even deeper, and there are other things that Jesus says that are important for us to consider in terms of, okay, well, do we believe that this is really the way things work? So I picked a few that I think are pertinent. So Jesus says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. It seems that we've become very good at recognizing injustice when we see it in our world lately. And I think that's a good thing, because we can enter in and offer God's justice in those circumstances in appropriate ways. But I think the important thing is, do we believe what Jesus says? Do we believe that our hunger for righteousness or justice, or I've heard translations that say equity, do we believe that Jesus is going to satisfy that and bring justice? Because if we don't, and we just have a hunger for righteousness, we're going to be disappointed, we're going to be frustrated, we're going to become cynical, and it's going to be hard to move forward in love. Second, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. So these second points, I think are good examples of where it's important that we come together as a community, and I express what I'm hearing from Jesus in a specific part of the Bible, or just from my prayer time, and I have to share that with you and say, do you think I'm applying this correctly? Because if I take this verse and I say, well, all right, I had a 401k, but that's tomorrow, and so I'm going to just spend all of my money and I'm not going to work because Jesus told me not to worry about it, and I got to be obedient. Well, hopefully some of you will come and say, yeah, that is what Jesus said, but I don't think you're applying it correctly. However, I think we are spending a lot of time being anxious for tomorrow. So the difference there being, okay, we don't know how long this pandemic's going to last. We don't know what's going to happen with everything, and there's a lot of uncertainty in the future. And there comes a point where we're no longer planning and trying to be responsible, and we're just worrying, and we're just being anxious. And I think what that does for us is it actually puts us back on the throne, because as we're being anxious and we're thinking, okay, well, how am I going to account for this and this and this? We're enforcing a belief in ourselves that actually we're on the throne and we're able to take care of all this, and Jesus isn't really going to take care of us. Finally, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and it will be opened to you. So I think this is another verse that's really important to discuss in the context of community. So if I'm asking for something, I may not get that exact thing. The wider context of this passage is Jesus then goes to say, God is your father, and what good father, when their child asks for a fish, gives them a snake? So what he's saying is, come to me as a child and ask for things, and I will give you things. And I think this is important to believe, because otherwise, why pray? Why talk to God? Why bring our desires before God? But it's also important to keep inside the context of community and ask other people, okay, am I believing what's true about this verse? Okay, so that's kind of talking about what the kingdom is, how things work in the kingdom of God, and the different aspects. So the cool thing is, we are being part of the kingdom of God, get to move forward and act and do things that have impact. So I want to now come back to the two parables and make some observations based on the ideas of the kingdom. So with this seed, in the last parable, we were talking about how the kingdom of heaven is the man who sows the seed, and then the seed, takes effect. Well, now Jesus is comparing the kingdom to a seed itself. So what he's saying is, my kingdom is going to start out small, and it's going to look one way, and then it's going to get bigger. But like a seed, it takes time. So seeds take a long time to grow, especially if you plant it in the ground and you stand back and just start to wait for it to grow. And that's a really silly thing to do, even though I thought that's what happened. They showed the time-lapse videos as kids, and I thought, oh, so that must happen overnight. I got to really pay better attention. But no, that's not the way that seeds grow. So it takes a long time. So when we are acting in the kingdom of heaven, when we are following Jesus and we're doing things, we have to have patience, because Jesus is going to work, and sometimes it might be sudden, but a lot of the time it's going to take a while to grow. A lot is happening here where we can't see. So this is a cross section. So above ground, for the first 3 phases, you see nothing. You're just standing there and you're thinking, well, I hope something's going to happen because I don't see any effect whatsoever. And that's the time where we need to be faithful and have trust and faith in God. But even after the seed has burst through the ground and grown, you can see there's still a lot going on underneath the ground that we still can't see. So we should be careful to not draw conclusions just based on what we can see, even long after. And then if, say in that second phase or third phase where it's just starting to do stuff underground, if we look at that and we say, okay, I don't see anything, so I'm going to check and see how the seed's doing. And so I'm going to dig it up and take it out and look at it. Oh, okay, it looks good, and put it back. That's going to be unhealthy. And I think one of the ways that we can do that is if we're looking at what's going on in the church, in America, in our community, and we just get discouraged and we start making accusations or becoming negative, as opposed to asking Jesus earnestly, wow, it feels really broken, and what are you doing in your kingdom and in your church? But it just causes damage if we're just digging it up and examining it and not being patient and letting Jesus do things in his timing. Let's see, what else? So I think this one is another big thing. So when the seed has finally grown, it looks way different than when it started out. So I may think, okay, well, I'm going to do this kind thing to my brother. I'm going to say, I'm going to try really hard to listen to him. So Peter came over this afternoon, and I said a couple things, and sometimes he reacted well, but other times he didn't react the way that I thought he would. And so if I were to conclude, well, okay, here's the thing. I'm planting a bean, so what I should see at the end is just a huge bean on the output. Well, that's a mistake. So I have to trust that God's working in our relationship through my decisions to be kind and patient, even if the outcome doesn't look like I would expect it to look. So that's the first parable. The second is the kingdom of heaven being compared to leaven, which is yeast. And so on the left you have an unleavened bread, and the right, the yeast has been put in the bread, and it looks a lot tastier. And one of the things Peter pointed out is okay, so in the Jewish culture, leaven, they know all about leaven because God told them, okay, especially in these festivals, you have to get rid of leaven. I mean, you can't have a speck of it in your house. You got to really scour everything. And that wasn't just a thing where they're like, oh yeah, that leaven is so bad, we got to get rid of that. They actually really liked leaven, so it was a sacrifice. But it was a big deal, and they were familiar with God talking about leaven in a very negative context. So I want to go into a few of the passages where that's brought up, particularly in the New Testament. So most of them have to do with the Pharisees when they come before Jesus. So this first one, Jesus is talking about the hypocrisy that he sees in the Pharisees. And he says, "Nothing is covered up that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. Therefore, whatever you have said in the dark shall be heard in the light, and whatever you have whispered in private rooms shall be proclaimed on the housetops." So the way the Pharisees were operating was they said, okay, well, I've got this part of my life and this part, and this part looks really good, and I've got all my tassels, and I'm praying really fancily, and everyone thinks I'm great. In this compartment, it's not so convenient to follow God, but I really like preserving this, so I'm going to just kind of not listen to God in this way, and that other stuff will be fine, because these don't really have anything to do with each other. Well, the reason Jesus uses leaven as an example is because leaven, you can put a small bit of it in your bread. The parable, I think it's 3 measures, which is about 60 pounds of bread. So we're talking a lot of bread, and the leaven works its way through the whole thing. So the Pharisees were kidding themselves when they said, okay, well, it's not great, but this is fine. The second example is Paul is addressing a church in the Corinthians where they are embracing sexual immorality and they're proud about it. And he says, "Your boasting is not good. Don't you know that a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old yeast so that you may be a new, unleavened batch as you really are. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Therefore let us keep the festival not with the old bread, leavened with malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." So in this passage, Paul is saying something that I think is relevant to today, which is that the world is saying, okay, what God says about sex and family and marriage, that's not really right. We've got the correct definition. And so actually what God says is wrong and despicable, and we got to get rid of it. So we have to be careful, because if we choose to believe that a little bit, or if we choose to be proud of that, that's going to affect all of our ministry and our relationships and everything. We can't kid ourselves. But I know for me, it's easy for me to look and say, that person is just so broken in their sexuality, and that person is not correct in the way that they live with their family or whatever. But then I go home and I don't think about the fact that I watch a 007 movie with my wife in which there's a couple scenes that are a little questionable, and I think, that's not so good, but okay, well, it only lasted 30 seconds. And then, well, actually, this whole movie was about a guy who is a professed adulterer, and he's very enthusiastic about that, and he's all about it. So my brother-in-law made a meme this morning of me saying, "You shall not watch 007 anymore." So hopefully that goes viral. But I don't want to say that. What I think is important is we need to be considering in our lives, how are we being leavened by what we're putting in front of our eyes with our entertainment and the things that we're thinking about. The last example that I want to talk about is what I would term as faithlessness. So this is when the Pharisees were coming to test Jesus, and they're asking him tricky questions to try and trip him up and say, you're not really with it. And he responds in the same way. He says, "Beware the leaven of the Pharisees." And I thought, well, that's kind of leaven. I mean, that they're what they're doing isn't good, but how is that leaven? And I think the reason that it is because what they were seeking to do was supplant Jesus from his throne and put themselves back on the throne. And again, that's not a thing that they can just be casual about and think, well, I don't really like this Jesus guy, and I'm just going to be slightly rebellious here, and everything else will be fine. Okay, so we've talked for a little while about how bad leaven is. So it's interesting what Jesus does in this parable. So he knows his audience. He knows he's talking to people who are very aware of how bad leaven is. And what he says is, the kingdom of heaven is like this horrible thing that you guys know about. So I don't think that hits home quite as well with us because, I think of leaven and I think of sourdough starter, and I think, I can't wait for my wife to not make another loaf of bread. So I want to use a different example. So I think Jesus wants us to consider that the kingdom of heaven is like COVID. So COVID is really serious, and people have died from it. People have been really affected by it. So I don't want to make light of this. I think it is worth us thinking about, because I look at different parts on these curves where things trend upward, and I know like what I was thinking, what I was feeling, the fear, and the oh man, this is really blowing up. And I think this is what Jesus wants us to. He wants us to see that's what the kingdom is like. The kingdom is this thing that gets in and it pervades everything. And that's hard for me to believe. So I can always think of leaven in negative terms. That's really easy. When things like this happen, wow, 2020 was bad, but it's like, well, yeah, of course everything went wrong. Like that's just my default way of thinking. Yeah, leaven in a bad sense. Of course, I'm going to watch this show and it's going to ruin my life and I'm going to end up on the streets somehow. But I think Jesus is asking us to have that attitude about our actions in the kingdom, and to believe that the work that he's going to do is contagious, that it spreads quickly, and that it's a really powerful force for good. So I want to discuss my applications for how Jesus is inviting me to take the negative examples of leaven and say, how can I do kingdom actions in these examples? So the first being the Pharisees' hypocrisy. So I think the opposite of hypocrisy here would be how can I have integrity in the kingdom? And particularly at work, because that's one of my main social circles, especially in the last year. Someone will come in and they'll mention, it'll start out, we're talking about work things. And then, Frank will get mentioned. And I'll say, oh yeah, that was kind of bad. And then 5 minutes later, I don't know where the time went, but we're bashing on Frank really bad. And there is no Frank that works in our company. So, and actually, last week I had, I was talking to another guy, and we thought everyone else had left for lunch, and so we were talking about Frank, and Frank walked out from behind the corner, and we're like, oh wow, and so I have to think back to what Jesus said about, therefore, whatever you have said in the dark shall be heard, and whatever you have whispered in private rooms shall be proclaimed in the housetops. So it's easy for me to recognize, oh, yeah, okay, that was bad, and that's going to have a really bad leavening effect. What's not as exciting is to think about how I could respond the way Jesus would respond when someone mentions Frank in a negative light. Because it's either being willing to just listen, I think, or responding with a, well, yeah, I mean, maybe hearing what their frustration is, but not entering into the gossip. And I know that's what Jesus is inviting me, but what I have trouble with is believing that Jesus is going to do powerful, amazing things with something little like that. So I want to look at that as a seed, as the leaven. I want to look at that as, no, Jesus is going to do great things with the small things that we do. The second, where it's, we're not falling in line with the way that Jesus, well, we're disagreeing with what the culture says about what family is. I think the real response here is, one, if we see someone out of calibration with God in our community, I know my two gut responses are to just judge them or to kind of try and find a Christianese way to talk about them and say, man, I was really struggling to figure out how to minister to so-and-so, but can you believe this thing that they did? And did you give the sermon on breastplate of righteousness? Yeah, so I really like that idea of the subtle distinction of how can I avoid accusing someone of not having their breastplate attached and you're not righteous, versus going to them and saying, how can I help you keep your breastplate of righteousness well fitted? So the idea being, how can I be uplifting in the way that I talk to them as opposed to degrading? And then the other thing is just how can we live together in unity with our families, especially. I know a lot of challenges of interacting in a graceful, loving way with my family in the last year. I think I've flip-flopped back and forth on who's more conservative or liberal about a specific thing. But, I've had several times where I know what's right, and I come into this conversation with them, and I'm like, well, you're doing this wrong, or you need to, and what I'm not considering is, how can I see, first and foremost, Christ in you? How can I see the identity of Jesus in you first, and then set aside, put far away this issue, which is important to discuss, right? We have to discuss with our family how we're going to relate, what precautions we're going to take, and all of that stuff. So I think those are important conversations to have, but in order to love properly in those, we have to see from Jesus's eyes. David in the Psalms says, "Behold how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell in unity. It is like the precious oil on the head running down on the beard of Aaron. It's like the dew of Hermon which falls in the mountains of Zion, for therefore the Lord has commanded the blessing, life forevermore." And I think the idea here is just dwelling together peacefully, living in harmony with family who's maybe difficult to get along with is an incredibly profound, leavening thing to do. And we should have faith that Jesus is going to do powerful things in our lives through that. The last, so the opposite of faithlessness, I think what Jesus is inviting me is to move forward and take a risk that I might have gotten it wrong what I heard about God. And again, coming back to what I said before about this especially needs to be done in the context of community. I need to be open and humble and willing to listen to other people who may come to me and say, I think you said that thing in an unloving way. But what I tend to do is stick in analysis mode. And what I've discovered is if you just stay in analysis mode forever, you never have to make a decision. You never have to move forward and do the right thing. And I think what Jesus is saying is, okay, instead of trying to stay on the throne yourself through analysis mode, put me on the throne and do your best to follow me, and maybe you'll get it wrong sometimes, but I'm going to bring people along, and I've given you my word to help correct that. So finally, so we're talking about these parables and how we can do things inside of the kingdom. So what I want to wrap up with is looking at the Lord's Prayer that we said earlier. So sorry if this is a little small. This is the entire Lord's Prayer, and stanza, 3 through 5, which is a big chunk of it, is talking about the kingdom. So in the prayer that Jesus gives us, where he's really condensed things down to here's what really matters. Here's what you should pray about. A big chunk of it is talking about his kingdom. So even though it's maybe an abstract concept, it's a lot easier, I think, for us to think about salvation and Jesus dying for us so that we don't go to this fiery hot place and we get to go play harps or whatever. The kingdom is a lot more abstract, and but Jesus says it's important. He talks about the kingdom even more than he talks about salvation. So it's important for us to wrestle with. But then I think the last thing that I notice here is almost all of this prayer is asking God to do things. So it's about what God's going to do. God is giving us bread. He's forgiving us. He's leading us out of temptation. He's delivering us from evil. So I don't know if this is just my generation or if it's everyone, but I have this tendency to want to save the whole world. So something bad happens, like the January 6th Capitol riots, and I think, oh man, there's all these people posting on Facebook, and all this stuff is going on, and I gotta fix this. I have to make everything better. And I don't actually say that out loud, but that's what I think. I'm like, I have to fix this. And I think when we look at the kingdom from the proper context, that should lift that burden from us, because we should recognize God's doing all this work. We just get to play a part in it. So instead of, that doesn't mean we should get complacent. It means that we should be excited to join in on what he's doing instead of being burdened by it. So that is the entirety of what I had to say. Curious what the Spirit might be saying to you. If you have any thoughts or questions.
We have a couple minutes.
I like
Yeah.
the idea that when you were showing the cross section of the plants growing up, and the idea that sometimes we want to pull the seed out and break it open to see if it's working, and how destructive that is to the process. And I think of that in terms of when we ask for forgiveness from someone. A lot of times we ask for forgiveness because, that's the thing to do, and we might even be really genuine. But then the discomfort of not yet receiving it, we a lot of times we're like, okay, well, let's pull the seed out and look at it. Did they forgive me? And
Yeah.
and it sort of disrupts the process. And I think there's a lot of ways of being in community where letting the seed open underground where we can't necessarily see. It feels like there's a lot of things in community that are like that.
At the beginning passage, when it's talking about the mustard seed being the smallest seed and how it grows into the largest of all the garden plants, I also want to point out that so many vegetables actually are derived from the mustard seeds, such as like broccoli and cauliflower and kale and all these awesome things. And like, so I love the mustard seed just because it's like, first of all, like some of my favorite veggies come from the mustard seed. And like, but like also like just the tiniest little seed, like not only does it grow to be the largest, but it also grows to be the most diverse. And so, that I just wanted to throw that out there because that's what I came to my mind. So
Cool. Yeah, I hope using a bean for my picture wasn't too offensive to anyone who actually knows about plants. But yeah, thank you for.
I liked your analogy of, let me straighten your breastplate of righteousness. And it made me think about how often God is not asking me to do that with someone. He's asking me to maybe give broccoli or cauliflower or something else, provide that. And I'm like, but the breastplate of righteousness right here, if we just focus on this. And it's like, God, no!
Yeah, thanks.